Lieutenant Commander Nigel Sharkey Ward locked his Blue Fox radar onto a contact 180 nautical miles northwest of the Outer Hebrides and read back the bearing to HMS Invincible's operations room in a voice stripped of inflection. The date was September 14th, 1981. The contact was a Tupolev Tu-95 RTS Bear D, wingspan 51 meters, 4 Kuznetsov turboprops driving contra-rotating propellers loud enough to be heard on passive sonar at depth. The Sea Harrier FRS.1 he was flying had been declared operational with 801 Naval Air Squadron only weeks earlier. Fleet Air Arm Doctrine, drafted at Yeovilton and signed off at Northwood, required that any Soviet maritime reconnaissance aircraft entering the NATO exercise area be intercepted, photographed at close range, and shadowed until it turned for Olenya or Severomorsk. Ward closed to visual, pulled alongside the Bear's starboard wing at 20,000 feet, and held station 3 aircraft lengths off the Soviet navigator's blister. The Russian crew waved. He photographed the tail number. Then he dropped back, slid under the fuselage and rose on the port side to do it again. The exercise was Ocean Venture 81, the largest NATO maritime deployment since 1945. 83 warships, 3 carriers, 300 aircraft, sweeping from the Norwegian Sea to the Denmark Strait. The Royal Navy contributions centered on Invincible and the older Hermes, and the point Whitehall wanted made was narrow and specific. The 1981 Nott Defense Review, published in June under the title The Way Forward, had proposed selling Invincible to Australia, paying off Hermes and reducing the surface fleet to a North Atlantic anti-submarine screen subordinated to American carrier groups. Admiral Sir Henry Leach, First Sea Lord, had fought the review inside the Ministry of Defence and lost most of it. What he had preserved was the Sea Harrier and the ski jump ramp. An Ocean Venture was his opportunity to demonstrate, in front of the Americans and in sight of the Soviets, that the fleet air arm could still put a supersonic-capable interceptor over the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap without asking permission from anyone. The Bears came in pairs, staging from Kola Peninsula airfields on 12-hour transits down the Norwegian coast, refueling in the air, then crossing the GI-UK gap to shadow the exercise. Northern Fleet Naval Aviation flew them. The RT's variant carried big bulge surface search radar and a data link to Q anti-ship missile submarines. GCHQ's outstation at Brora and the American SOSUS terminal at Keflavik tracked their electronic emissions before Fylingdales had a paint. By the third day of the exercise, 801 Squadron had logged 14 separate Bear intercepts. Ward's pilots were flying 2 sorties each per day off Invincible's 7-degree ramp, launching in sea states that would have kept a phantom on deck. The Sea Harrier's Blue Fox was a modest radar with a 20-mile useful range against a bear-sized target. But the vectoring came from the carrier's Type 1022 and from the Nimrod MR.2S of 206 Squadron working out of Kinloss. The choreography was tight and it was British. On September 15th, Ward and his wingman Lieutenant Steve Thomas found something over the Denmark Strait that the Air Warfare Centre had not briefed them to expect. 2 Bear Ds in loose combat trail, dropping below the cloud base as if they intended to overfly the exercise force at 500 feet. Thomas called the contact first, angle off port at 11 o'clock, altitude descending through 8,000 feet. Ward acknowledged and pushed the throttle forward. The Sea Harrier accelerated poorly at low level compared to a Phantom or a Tomcat, but it did not need to catch a bear from behind. The Soviet aircraft's cruise speed was 400 knots, and both British pilots were already ahead of the intercept geometry. They came down through the overcast a mile abeam of the lead Tupolev and formed up on either wingtip simultaneously. The Soviet aircraft commander, visible in the flight deck greenhouse, turned his head to look at Ward, then at Thomas, then forward again. He did not alter course. What happened next was recorded in Ward's post-flight report, filed at Invincible's Air Intelligence Cell that evening, and forwarded to the Directorate of Naval Intelligence at Northwood the following morning. Ward slid his aircraft forward until the Sea Harrier's nose was level with the Bear's cockpit windows, held station for the count of 10, then rolled inverted, pulled through and came up on the Tupolev's opposite wing. Thomas did the same. The two Sea Harriers then executed what Ward later described as a barrel roll around the Bear D, flying a coordinated helical path around the Soviet aircraft's longitudinal axis, while it maintained straight and level flight. The maneuver was flown twice. The Bear pilots did not report the intercept over their operational frequencies, which GCHQ was monitoring in real time from Cheltenham through the Cyprus relay at Agios Nikolaos. There was no radio traffic to Severomorsk, no encrypted burst, no acknowledgement that the intercept had taken place at all. The absence of Soviet communications was itself the intelligence product. The Joint Intelligence Committee's weekly assessment for the period 14th to 20th September, chaired by Sir Anthony Duff, noted that Northern Fleet Naval Aviation had declined to characterize the September intercepts in operational reporting, and that Bear D crews returning to Olenia appeared to have filed sortie logs recording routine reconnaissance with no interceptor contact. Duff's committee drew a specific conclusion. The Soviet General Staff was unwilling to acknowledge in writing that a subsonic vectored thrust aircraft flying from a light carrier the Nott Review had proposed to sell had established gun camera range parity with strategic reconnaissance assets over the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. To acknowledge it was to concede that the gap was not the Soviet lake the Northern Fleet had spent a decade claiming. Margaret Thatcher was briefed on the exercise outcomes on September 28th at Chequers in a Cabinet Office paper prepared jointly by the MOD and the Foreign Office. The briefing note, released to the National Archives at Kew under the 20-year rule in 2011 as PREM 19/667, is redacted around the specific intercept geometries, but records the Prime Minister's marginal annotation next to a paragraph on Sea Harrier performance. Show this to John Nott. Nott's way forward was already law, but the Sea Harrier and Invincible had for the moment been saved from it. 6 months later, on April 2nd, 1982, Argentine Special Forces landed at Mullet Creek on East Falkland. Invincible sailed south with Hermes on April 5th. The aircraft Ward's pilots had rolled around Soviet Bears over the North Atlantic were now the only fixed-wing air defense the task force possessed. Ward himself took 801 Squadron south aboard Invincible. His Ocean Venture logbook went with him. The Sea Harrier itself was a compromise the Royal Navy had extracted from the Treasury by refusing to die. When the 1966 Defence Review under Dennis Healy cancelled CVA-01, the 55,000-ton conventional carrier designed to replace Ark Royal and Eagle, the Fleet Air Arm's fixed-wing future was ended by ministerial fiat. Healy's argument, made to the House on February 22, 1966, was that RAF land-based aircraft operating from Aden, Singapore, and Gan could cover any commitment east of Suez more cheaply than a carrier group. The first Sea Lord of the day, Admiral Sir David Luce, resigned. His deputy, the Minister of Defence for the Royal Navy, Christopher Mayhew, resigned with him. Neither resignation reversed the decision. Ark Royal soldiered on until 1978, flying Phantoms and Buccaneers. When she paid off, the Fleet Air Arm's fast jet capability was, on paper, extinguished. The Invincible class had been designed around this extinction. The lead ship was ordered in 1973 as a through-deck cruiser, a phrase drafted by Ministry of Defence procurement officials to conceal from cabinet colleagues, and specifically from the Treasury, that what was being built was a small aircraft carrier. The 9 anti-submarine Sea King helicopters the class was nominally designed to operate did not require a 210-metre flight deck. What did require it was the Hawker Siddeley P.1127 development lineage that ran through the RAF Harrier, GR1 to the naval FRS-1, an aircraft that used vectored thrust to launch from a short deck, loiter on combat air patrol, and land vertically with a useful reserve of fuel. The ski jump ramp tested at RAE Bedford by Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor RN added 30% to the launch payload. Taylor's paper on the ramp's aerodynamics, presented to the Royal Aeronautical Society in 1976, was classified restricted. The ramp itself was welded onto Invincible's bow in 1978. The Blue Fox radar was the compromise inside the compromise. Ferranti's engineers at Edinburgh had wanted a pulse Doppler set with look-down capability. The Ministry of Defence budget for the Sea Harrier programme, capped at £84 million for radar development, forced them to adapt the existing Sea Spray helicopter radar. Blue Fox could not look down over land or heavy sea clutter. It could search out to 30 nautical miles against a large target and track from 20. Against a Tu-95 at cruise altitude in clear air over the North Atlantic, it was adequate. Against an Argentine Skyhawk running in low over the sea at Bomb Alley, it was, as Ward wrote in his memoir, a radar for a different war. The aircraft entered service with 800 Naval Air Squadron aboard Invincible on March 31, 1980. It carried two 30mm Aden cannon and a pair of AIM-9L Sidewinders. The all-aspect L model, delivered to the Royal Navy under an emergency procurement authorized by the Reagan administration in April 1982 as task force ships steamed south. The airframe itself weighed 6,374 kilograms, empty, and could reach Mach 0.9 in level flight, which was slower than every fighter the Soviet Union operated, and slower than every fighter the Argentine Air Force operated. Its combat radius on internal fuel was 250 nautical miles. What it could do, and no Soviet or Argentine aircraft could match, was launch from a 5,000-ton platform in Force 8 Seas. The Tu-95 was the aircraft the Sea Harrier had been built to embarrass, and the reason was written into the geography of the North Atlantic. From the airfields of the Kola Peninsula, Olenia, Kipilovo, and the Naval Air Base at Severomorsk 1, the Bear D and its longer-legged sibling, the Tu-142, could reach the Iceland Faroes Gap in 6 hours, loiter for another 8 over the exercise areas where American carrier battle groups and British ASW forces were training, and return to base without refueling. Northern Fleet Naval Aviation flew roughly 200 such sorties a year through the 1970s. Each one was tracked by GCHQ's Composite Signals Organization Station at Brora, by the RAF's radar chain at Buchan and Saxavord, and by the American SOSUS hydrophone arrays, whose British terminus was at Brawdy in Pembrokeshire. The intercepts were flown until the Sea Harrier arrived by RAF Phantom FG-1s of 43 Squadron and 111 Squadron from Luchas, and later by Tornado F-3s. The problem the Fleet Air Arm posed to Northern Fleet Naval Aviation was not that a Sea Harrier could shoot down a bear. A Phantom could do that. The problem was that a Sea Harrier could be launched from anywhere on the ocean the Royal Navy chose to sail. The strategic logic of the Bear D was that it would find NATO carrier groups outside the range of land-based interceptors, transmit their positions to Northern Fleet submarines, and enable a coordinated anti-carrier strike using SS-N-3 or SS-N-12 cruise missiles. If the carrier group carried its own interceptors, the Bear had to close within the interceptor's radius to acquire a firm targeting solution, and Blue Fox, imperfect as it was, could hold a Bear at 20 miles. The equation broke down. The Northern Fleet's anti-carrier concept, developed by Admiral Sergei Gorshkov and refined through the 1970s exercises Okean 70 and Okean 75, depended on Bears operating in a maritime interception vacuum. Invincible closed the vacuum. This was the point Admiral Leach had made repeatedly to the Chiefs of Staff Committee during the Nott Review debates through the spring of 1981. His argument, recorded in the committee minutes now held at Q under DEFE 32, was that the Royal Navy's contribution to NATO's Eastern Atlantic Command, CINCEASTLANT, was not surface anti-submarine warfare in isolation. It was the ability to deploy organic air power forward of the GI-UK gap into the Norwegian Sea and force the Northern Fleet to fight for its own coastline before it could reach the Atlantic sea lanes. Without a carrier, that mission fell entirely to American CVBGs operating from Norfolk, Virginia. With a carrier, even a small one, the Royal Navy retained a seat at the operational planning table in Norfolk that no amount of Type 22 frigate procurement could buy. John Nott's memoir, Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, published in 2002, records his own view that the Sea Harrier had been underestimated at the ministry in 1981. The rehabilitation was retrospective. In September of that year, the Prime Minister's marginal note on the Ocean Venture briefing, "Show this to John Nott," represented the first internal Whitehall recognition that the way forward had been drafted without a full appreciation of what the fleet air arm could do to Soviet strategic reconnaissance. Ward's squadron, meanwhile, was still flying 2 sorties a day. The Falklands Campaign that followed in April, May, and June 1982 has been documented at length. What is less often recorded is how directly the tactical vocabulary developed against Soviet bears in September 1981 translated to the operational demands of the South Atlantic. 801 Squadron flew from Invincible, 800 Squadron from Hermes. Between them, 28 Sea Harrier FRS .1s covered a task force of over 100 ships against an Argentine Air Force and naval aviation, flying more than 200 combat aircraft from mainland bases at Rio Gallegos, Rio Grande, and Comodoro Rivadavia. 23 Argentine aircraft were shot down by Sea Harriers, 20 by AIM-9L Sidewinder, 3 by 30mm cannon. No Sea Harrier was lost in air-to-air combat. 6 were lost to ground fire, accidents, or unknown causes. The AIM-9L delivery had been arranged through the Reagan administration by Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, over the objections of the American State Department under Alexander Haig. Haig was still attempting mediation between London and Buenos Aires through the last week of April. Weinberger authorized the missile transfer in parallel, using existing NATO stockpile arrangements to avoid the delay of a fresh congressional notification. The Sidewinders were flown from Naval Air Station Sigonella in Sicily to Ascension Island aboard C-141 starlifters and cross-decked to the task force by Sea King. The first delivery reached Hermes on May 3rd. On May 1st, before the L models arrived in quantity, Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton of 801 Squadron shot down a Mirage 3 of Grupo 8 over West Falkland, using an earlier AIM-9G, the first British air-to-air kill since Korea. The specific maneuver Ward and Thomas had flown around the Bear D in September 1981 did not translate directly to Falklands combat, because Argentine pilots were not flying straight and level at 400 knots waiting to be photographed. What did translate was the discipline of ground-controlled intercept from a British carrier in a hostile electromagnetic environment. The controllers aboard Invincible and Hermes, many of them the same fighter direction officers who had worked Ocean Venture, vectored Sea Harriers onto Argentine strike packages with a precision that Argentine post-war analyses have attributed in part to the density and quality of the training exercises the Fleet Air Arm had been permitted to conduct in the North Atlantic in the year before. The Argentine Air Force's official history, published in 1998, notes that Sea Harrier CAPs appeared to have knowledge of our attack routes before we had committed to the run-in. Some of this was Nimrod MR2 electronic intelligence. Some of it was the American AWACS aircraft based at Ascension. Some of it was simply fighter direction officers who had spent September 1981 vectoring intercepts against an opponent whose transponders were switched off. Sharkey Ward's own combat record for the campaign included 3 confirmed kills: a Puma helicopter on May 9th, a Skyhawk on May 21st, and a Hercules C-130 on June 1st, the last using guns after his Sidewinder failed to guide. He was awarded the DSC. His book Sea Harrier Over the Falklands, published in 1992, is polemical about the RAF's Harrier GR3 contribution and about what he described as the Ministry of Defence's continued failure to appreciate the FRS.1 after the war. The polemic is not universally accepted by other participants. The strategic point, however, stands. The Sea Harrier's Cold War significance is often collapsed into its Falklands record, and the collapse conceals what the aircraft actually did between 1980 and 1991. The Falklands were an 11-week campaign against a Latin American opponent. The North Atlantic mission was an 11-year continuous confrontation with the Soviet Northern Fleet, and the operational data generated by Sea Harrier intercepts of Bear D and Tu-142 reconnaissance flights formed a specific contribution to NATO's understanding of Soviet maritime strike doctrine. The reporting chain was tight. Every Sea Harrier intercept generated a mission report filed to the ship's air intelligence officer, thence to the Directorate of Naval Intelligence at Old Admiralty Building in Whitehall, thence to the Defence Intelligence Staff at the MOD Main Building. A parallel copy went to GCHQ Cheltenham, where the Composite Signals Organization's Soviet military section correlated the visual intercept data with signals intelligence on Northern Fleet naval aviation communications, weather reporting, and refueling activity at Kola Peninsula airfields. A tertiary copy went to the Joint Intelligence Committee, which included the assessments in its weekly Red Book, distributed to the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, and Defence Secretary. This was the machinery Sir Percy Craddock chaired as JIC chairman from 1985 to 1992, and which he described in his memoirs as the least glamorous and most consequential element of British Cold War intelligence. Sir Percy's assessment was that Soviet maritime strategy in the North Atlantic through the 1980s was more brittle than Western commentary suggested at the time. The bastion concept, under which Northern Fleet ballistic missile submarines would be defended by attack submarines and surface forces in the Barents and Norwegian seas rather than sortied into the open Atlantic, was already established by the time Ocean Venture 81 was flown. What Sea Harrier operations demonstrated to the Northern Fleet staff was that even the reconnaissance flights on which bastion defence depended were subject to close interception whenever NATO chose to deploy a carrier. Admiral Vladimir Chernavin, who commanded the Northern Fleet from 1981 to 1985 and became Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy in 1985, wrote after the Cold War that naval aviation's inability to operate freely in the Norwegian Sea from the mid-1980s onwards was a recurring difficulty in Northern Fleet planning. He did not name the Sea Harrier. He did not need to. The GIUK Gap intercept program continued through 1991. Ocean Safari 85, Northern Wedding 86, Teamwork 88. Each exercise produced its own tranche of Bear intercepts. Each intercept fed the intelligence machinery. Each assessment reached the JIC. The pattern established in September 1981 became routine. Invincible was not sold to Australia. Hermes was paid off in 1985 and sold to India, replaced in the fixed-wing role by Illustrious and Ark Royal. The Sea Harrier FRS.1 was upgraded to FA.2 standard through the late 1980s and early 1990s, with the Blue Vixen radar replacing Blue Fox and the AIM-12 OAMRAAM replacing the Sidewinder as primary armament. The FA-2 entered service in 1993. By then the Cold War the aircraft had been designed to fight was over. The Berlin Wall had come down in November 1989. Soviet forces had withdrawn from Eastern Europe. The Northern Fleet, starved of fuel and spare parts, was tying up its Bear D fleet at Olenia and Kipilovo. The last Bear intercept from a British Sea Harrier in the Cold War proper was flown from Ark Royal in the Norwegian Sea in the autumn of 1991. The bureaucratic story of the Sea Harrier inside Whitehall is quieter than the operational story, and in some respects more revealing about how British defence policy was actually made between 1980 and 1991. The aircraft had been protected from cancellation in 1981, not by strategic argument alone, but by the specific institutional position of Sir Henry Leach, who as First Sea Lord had direct access to the Prime Minister, and used it. Leach's account of his meeting with Margaret Thatcher on the evening of March 31st, 1982, the night before the Argentine landings, is well documented. He told her the task force could sail, and that it should sail. Less well documented is his role through the previous year in ensuring that the task force existed to be sailed. The 1981 Defence Review had originally proposed cutting the Royal Navy's destroyer and frigate force from 59 ships to 42, paying off Invincible immediately, and reducing Fleet Air Arm fixed-wing capability to a training cadre. Leach's counter-proposal, submitted to the Chiefs of Staff Committee in April 1981, accepted the frigate cut in principle, but insisted on retaining Invincible, Hermes, and a third carrier, either Illustrious or Ark Royal, whichever completed first. The retention was justified on the specific NATO commitment of maintaining a British contribution to the Eastern Atlantic striking fleet, and on the operational data being generated by Sea Harrier intercepts of Soviet reconnaissance flights. Leach lost the frigate argument. He won the carrier argument. The Way Forward, as published on June 25, 1981, retained all 3 Invincible-class ships and the Sea Harrier programme, while announcing the sale of Invincible to Australia, a sale that was to be completed by 1983. The sale to Australia was cancelled on May 21, 1982, 3 days after Argentine air attacks on the San Carlos landings had made the political impossibility of paying off Invincible clear to every member of the cabinet. The formal announcement was made by John Nott to the House of Commons, and it represented the single most concrete British defence policy reversal of the Thatcher years. The Sea Harrier had not saved itself. The war had saved it. But the war had been winnable in the specific form in which it was won because the Sea Harrier had been saved in September 1981, and Leach's argument in September 1981 had been anchored in the operational data from Ocean Venture. The Defence Intelligence Staff assessment of the Sea Harrier's Cold War contribution, prepared for the incoming major government in December 1990 and now held at Kew as DEFE 24, is characteristically dry. The assessment records that between 1980 and 1990, Sea Harrier aircraft of 800, 801 and 899 naval air squadrons had conducted approximately 340 intercepts of Soviet maritime reconnaissance aircraft in the Eastern Atlantic and Norwegian Sea. Of these, 289 had resulted in visual identification and photography of the Soviet aircraft. 51 had been aborted for weather, mechanical, or tactical reasons. The intelligence value of the visual identifications was assessed as significant for the earlier period and declining from 1988 onwards, as Soviet aviation activity in the Atlantic reduced in tandem with the Northern Fleet's fuel crisis. The assessment did not recommend fleet reductions. It recommended continued FA.2 procurement. Sir Michael Quinlan, Permanent Under-Secretary at the MOD from 1988 to 1992, signed the assessment off. Nigel Ward left the Royal Navy in 1984 as a commander, after being passed over for further promotion in a decision he attributed to his continuing criticism of the RAF Harrier community and of Ministry of Defence procurement priorities. His memoir, when it appeared in 1992, was reviewed unfavourably by several senior RAF officers and favourably by most Fleet Air Arm veterans. He worked in the defence industry through the 1990s and 2000s and was a persistent public advocate for the retention of naval fixed-wing aviation through the successive defence reviews that culminated in the 2010 decision to retire the Harrier GR.9 without a fixed-wing replacement until the F-35B entered Royal Navy service in 2020. Ward argued that decision was a repetition in structure and consequence of the 1966 cancellation of CVA-01. His argument is contested. It is not obviously wrong. Steve Thomas, Ward's wingman on the September 1981 Bear intercept, flew as Ward's number 2 through the Falklands Campaign. He was credited with 3 kills, 2 Mirage 3s on May 1st and a Skyhawk on May 21st. He remained in the Fleet Air Arm and retired as a commander. Admiral Sir Henry Leach retired as First Sea Lord in December 1982, 6 months after the Falklands victory. He died in 2011. His obituaries in the British broadsheet press credited him correctly with the specific act of political courage that had authorized the task force. They credited him less often with the 18 months of institutional argument through 1980 and 1981 that had ensured the task force possessed the aircraft and ships to sail with. The 2 acts were not separable. The second made the first possible. The last Sea Harrier FA.2 was withdrawn from Royal Navy service on March 28, 2006, following a decision announced by Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon in the 2002 Strategic Defence Review New Chapter. The withdrawal was justified on grounds of cost and the aircraft's limited air-to-ground capability compared to the RAF Harrier GR.9, which continued in Joint Force Harrier service until 2010. The Sea Harrier as an interceptor was not replaced. The Fleet Air Arm's ability to conduct organic maritime air defence lapsed between 2006 and the F-35B's operational deployment aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth in 2021. The Tu-95 Bear remains in Russian service. The Russian aerospace forces continue to fly reconnaissance sorties into the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. Intercepts are now conducted by RAF Typhoons from Lossiemouth, replacing the Tornado F.3 fleet retired in 2011. The intercepts are photographed, publicised on Ministry of Defence social media accounts, and treated as a matter of routine deterrent signalling. The specific tactical vocabulary that Ward and Thomas developed against Northern Fleet naval aviation from HMS Invincible in September 1981. The coordinated barrel roll, the wingtip station keeping, the silent close approach that denied the Soviet crew a clean report to their operational chain, survives in Royal Air Force intercept doctrine. The Kremlin, so far as the archives at Kew and Cheltenham record, never officially acknowledged what happened over the Denmark Strait on September 15, 1981. Silence was the answer. It was also the confession.